So I'm going to start off with just doing a primer around sort of responsible AI and what that really means, and then go on to a few themes under it, right? So what do we really mean when we say responsible AI? It needs to be transparent in objectives and outcomes. It needs to actively consider human right implications and mitigating, and has to mitigate risks. It needs to be inclusive at all levels. It needs to be responsive to system failures, and it also needs to respect data ownership. And this is, I mean, these are generally held principles. They're not, I'm not coming up with this is not new. This is just a consolidation of what already exists. And the other thing, as we go into this discussion, to get on the same page about is like when we talk about AI, we also need to talk about it from a much more sort of grounded perspective. So I prefer to think of them as automated decision-making systems, which essentially make decisions that have perhaps previously been taken by human agents. And these are distinct from computer programs in the fact that they are decisions made on various variables. So they're not a simple lookup function or a clear, like if this, then that. It has a few different variables, and that's how these decisions are made. And this might be obvious, but I just want to restate it so that we were all really on the same page. I'm going to go into some of the important themes to keep in mind as we talk about responsible AI, and and also maybe like bust some myths while we're at it. So the first thing I want to really talk about here is bias. So one big myth is that somehow when we take human beings out of the equation and place a machine to make those decisions, is that just purely the act of taking people out of the equation somehow makes it unbiased. And there couldn't be a bigger myth than that, because these decisions are still programmed in. The decision logic is made by individuals, is made by existing systems, and hence the system is implementing certain individuals' worldviews at scale. Make no mistake, that's exactly what is happening. And I mean, of course, we've seen implications of it in studies abroad, and we keep seeing some in India as well. So I guess to the people who are interested in participating in creating ethical systems or even automated decision systems, remember that the organizations and the people making it are consciously and unconsciously imposing your will on a large group of people, and that and that is what is really happening. So let's be clear about that. The second theme in here is one of scale, right? By definition, again, automated decision-making systems are implemented at scale. That's what makes it profitable. That's a whole business case for it, that we build it once and it essentially rolls out and is able to do it at scale. Now, in the product world, we have a saying that when you build for everyone, you end up building for no one. And and of course, then we sort of risk doing that a little bit when we build AI systems as well, where you make it for a few people, quite likely. So what's important here is to identify the personas that represent various critical groups and then design for them. And then human beings, we have a tendency to impose or project our views onto certain groups of people. So that affects the personas that you build if you aren't really taking the effort to understand that from these people directly, right? Instead of paraphrasing them, instead of putting down what you think they are thinking or what they need, you do need to paraphrase it, or wherever possible, quote it in their words. And also the other thing that we do as human beings is also, the groups that we know are comfortable with, perhaps relate to more, we put more details into it. And that's another way in which we end up designing more towards people who we know, or designing things for ourselves rather than designing it for the actual people who these systems are intended to. Especially when you think of top-down systems, right? Like public services, where it's not an opt-in, it's where everyone has to use that now in order to avail certain services. It's not something where they have an alternative. This is particularly important, which then brings us to the next theme of inclusion. So, and this conversations happen quite a lot, I would say, within the Indian tech design sort of environments where inside teams you hear things like, we are the experts, we know best. Again, myth, right? No, you don't. If you are not the person who you're designing for, if you're designing for somebody who lives in a rural area, you can make an educated guess at the best, but they know their reality more than you do. So I mean, and this mindset is changing, but again, if you are part of creating these systems, if you're part of that decision making process anywhere, please keep that in mind. So especially in a country like ours with so much diversity of language, culture, education, digital literacy, etc., building AI solutions are also a feat in diversity. That's going to be a big challenge, but also the biggest opportunity, right, for market differentiation, but also to make a difference. So as creators, you do have to understand sort of, again, real needs and nuances of the people who you're building it for. And this diversity of the people who will be using what you're building should be seen in your research, how much ever possible within your team, because that is where, again, micro decision making is happening, and definitely in your advisory panel. And that advisory panel needs to represent people who are reflective of all your stakeholders, including the people who are using it and the people who are affected by whatever product you're putting out. So and this is where, like, when we talk about how your team needs to be sort of structured, you also need to be using interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary team, wherever possible. People who already are familiar with two different domains that might not intuitively fit together. And this is because, say, for example, if we take a social scientist and a computer scientist, very different ways of working. Social scientists, very thorough, probably would take the time to do things right, and data scientists, very broad stroke, so don't hold me on this, but data scientists might be about getting the output, getting it based on accuracy, right? So there might be creative tensions there, but with those creative tensions, along with like a clear common objective, is what will improve your solution. So as much as possible, try to incorporate like researchers, lawyers, engineers, data scientists, social scientists and sector experts wherever you can. If you can't afford to have them on your team, just make sure you get those inputs, have regular checkpoints. That is in a lot of ways going to make or break your product. Now, what a lot of these essentially boil down to is this theme of power, because technology is not neutral. It is extremely, extremely powerful. And India is rich in skilled talent, eager to make a difference, right? And so we have plenty of problems that also need solutions at scale. So this is a wonderful opportunity to drive the nation forward. But that said, it's very important to constantly ask yourself this question: if you are in that privileged position of designing for others, designing decision-making systems for others, you need to ask yourself, why are you doing the work that you're doing, right? And maybe you want to give rural areas a level playing field. Maybe you want to make education accessible. All of that is great, but you need to ask yourself that every day, because good intentions are just not enough. The way the human impacts of tech work out, there's a little bit of a time gap. There's a little, it happens in different worlds. You sit and create it in a certain world, it plays out in a different world, and then how it impacts other lives happens somewhere else. And you're not going to see it just because you have you're well intentioned. You will have to actively go find that yourself, because it's, again, like a hammer might be a tool, to go back to the tech is not neutral thing. A hammer might be a tool, but AI is not a static tool. It is a complex and contextual system, and has a very active impact on people's everyday lives. So if you are involved in creating automated decision making system, ask yourself every day if the impacts you are aiming for are being met. Who is it not being met for? Where is it failing? How can you build an open and responsive feedback? This is particularly important because we don't see this being talked about enough. System failures are inevitable. It will happen, but when you're creating it, you need to be accounting for it. You need to allow people to tell you that the sooner the information gets to you, the sooner you can fix it, right? So how do you build an open and responsive feedback loop from where the system's failing? And also, what unforeseen risks are this creating? You do need to very actively question this, because this is not an easy information to find. Most people don't want to hear this information, but it is a reality. So what power does this give to people, and what power does this take away from people? Again, not intuitive questions, but keep asking yourself that. And hold your organization responsible for this as well. It might not be a conversation that your team or your organization is interested in having, but you are in there. If you're part of the system, ask them that question. And why? Just so that way you can avoid having an Oppenheimer moment, right? Robert Oppenheimer is the father of like the atomic bomb, and it's famously said that when he saw the mushroom cloud, he started questioning his own actions, and famously quoted, no, now I'm death myself. So don't wait for 3 years when you can see these risks balloon into catastrophic events. You can see it now. The way I've heard it articulated before is that ethical risks don't come up like an iceberg, right? It's as if your product is Titanic the boat, then it's as if there are small holes built in it over time, and at some point it becomes big. So don't wait for that big event. Keep looking for it actively. And we've also, I mean, maybe 5 or 10 years ago, you could say, well, I couldn't have seen that, but now there's no more excuse. There's enough information out there. We've seen lots of consequences, so they're not they might be unintended, but they're not unforeseeable. So I think part of your responsibility, if you are creating this, you have the power, or you are in such a powerful position by creating this, which means it is your responsibility to start looking for what could happen. So whenever you see presentations that says, oh, this is how we're changing X industry, or this is how we're improving people's life, or here's the market value that we're creating, ask what are some of the unintentional ways in which this could harm people. And this is not just an intellectual exercise. So ask how us falling short will affect people, and then go and fix it. That needs to be incorporated into your next product cycle. So if you have any ambition to be in this field, in being in building automated systems, remember that it's your every small action as you're building it does affect people in very concrete ways. And as a nation, we do tend to be quite enamored by AI because it allows us to leapfrog. It helps us build solutions at scale. And one way this presents is that how good an AI system is often measured internally, at least in terms of its accuracy. So, and that's really just not doing enough. That only tells you if it's good within your controlled lab environment, and when it moves into society, it needs to do a lot more than that. So I will just reinstate my summary of a responsible AI essentially is transparent in objectives, outcomes, actively considers human rights implications and mitigates risks. It's inclusive at all levels, is responsive to system failures, respects data ownership. And this is the definition of a well-functioning automated decision-making system. And anything short of this, you're actually being irresponsible. So let's responsible AI is just enough to make sense of it, but really that's actually what is the definition of a well-functioning system.